Before we get into it, I want to just apologize to a lot of the listeners that were expecting an episode to drop last month in February. I kind of figured out what was going on. It had something to do with bank account information on Apple Podcasts not really connecting, I guess, in some capacity. So got that figured out. And then another thing issued. So the good folks at Apple were able to kind of help me figure out what the reason was. So hopefully we don't run into that situation again. I want to be consistent with providing content a minimum once a month during the install, with a couple other thought leadership pieces sprinkled in between, or some steps folks can take to try to shore up their own privacy stuff. But with that, let's get right into the install. So here we go. Hello and welcome back. For those of you that have heard in the past, hello and welcome any new listeners to this March 2023 edition of the Data Privacy Party Install. This is where we talk about anything from data privacy, technology, data governance, data management, privacy law regulations, and just try to make this information as accessible as possible. I know the privacy landscape can be kind of difficult to navigate, and so one of the goals of this pod is just to make sure people kind of see what the information is that's out there, and then kind of digest it, maybe make it a little bit more understandable, and then allow folks to make the best decisions that they can about their own organization, about their own personal lives, and really take measures to protect whether it's an organization's IP or strategic objectives to an individual's own personal information that they may not want out there as often. They don't want to get bombarded with marketing emails to their personal inbox. So try to make things as easy as possible to understand with what's going on in the world. You can go check out dataprivacyparty.com to get a little bit more information and check out some of the content, thought leadership that we publish. This podcast, for instance, is going to be accessible through the website. And for those of you looking for it on Spotify, I apologize. We're not there just yet, but we're making moves on Apple Pod. You can find us as well. So go ahead, like, subscribe if you choose to and you enjoy the content. Otherwise, constructive criticism is also always appreciated. And we'll talk a little bit more about this before we even get into the first, latest breach news that we do as part of the install. Talking about what happened over the last 48 to 72 hours with Silicon Valley Bank. I'm sure most folks that are familiar with what's going on. For those of you that have not been paying any attention, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, shut down the bank on Friday. And then kind of if you want a good detailed analysis of what ended up happening, the guys at the All In podcast do a really, really great synopsis. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it because it doesn't really pertain to data privacy, but essentially a bank that was FDIC insured or FDIC insured was shut down. FDIC only insures up to $250,000 per individual at the bank. So for instance, if I had 2 or 3 accounts under my name at the bank with $250,000 in each account, the only insured amount I would receive that's protected would be $250,000 in total. It's not per account, it's per individual listed on the account, if that kind of makes sense. So and I bring this up because I think it's actually very important, especially across anyone doing sort of consulting, whether it's with those companies or otherwise, and for individuals too, just to know there's the reason this ended up happening. Part of it, companies are trying to cut costs and become more efficient. And in that process, trying to get out cash from the bank kind of resulted in, one person started to do it, a couple other people started to do it. And it just ended up compounding on itself to eventually lead to what is often called a run on the bank, where a ton of customers, depositors went to just withdraw money all kind of at the same time. The bank doesn't keep all the money on hand that they can meet that stuff. The movie It's a Wonderful Life does a good job of showing this out. I think by the end of the movie, they had $2 left in the bank. So ended up working out for the folks in there. But it's not something that we see very often. Part of the $250,000 insurance was to keep that from happening. So as you kind of look into it a little bit more, you can kind of see and take note, the regional banks are the ones that'll be most impacted by something like this. SVB was one of the largest banks that this has ever happened to, but primarily serving a lot of the tech industry in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that had their money kind of tied up because but one of many things that happened was that they purchased a lot of, or they levered themselves into not a financial, what do you call it, analyst, advisor, anything like that. So a lot of the information is from what I've kind of been reading and looking into. They made a lot of, I'll call it, risky decisions with some of the money. So as banks take your money, they loan it out. They use that to make more money. They don't keep all your $100,000 in your checking account on hand at the bank. They'll probably keep of your own money, roughly 10% is kind of the requirement. Because the idea is that most folks aren't going to go to withdraw all $100,000, $200,000 of their money at one time. And so they purchased, among other things, stuff like a 10-year treasury bond that is appreciating at approximately 2% per year by the end of its 10-year life per year over time, which seems like a pretty safe decision, especially for a big bank that can make those kind of risks with a moderate return, minimal to moderate return, and then sell them. Well, problem is, if you sell things like that, this doesn't just corporations, this is also me and you. When you sell stuff like that, you end up having to pay a penalty, or not realizing the full amount of what it is that you're looking for. And because of that, there's a huge loss that was incurred, and a lot of the investments just didn't realize their full potential. And so because of that, the bank didn't have enough, wasn't very solvent, wasn't very liquid. And part of a bigger issue in California, and I know I would need to look a little bit more into it, if you can't meet payroll, there actually opens you up to some liability towards your employees not being able to pay them. So that's why this is a big deal. Hopefully a lot of those companies can make payment for, 1 or 2 cycles coming up. Typically that's a good measure that they're going to be able to outlive this, but there's some folks that had a lot more assets tied up into the bank that are probably going to suffer quite a bit. So hopefully, by the end of this weekend, there's a good plan in place by the federal regulators to try to, soften the blow that this is going to take to a lot of the companies. And this isn't, Google, Amazon, the FANGs. They're not going to be the ones affected. This is going to be your startups. This is going to be the companies that, kind of in a way keep the bigger guys in check. Me and you would rather pay 10% less for a service for a startup that offers the same exact thing that one of the bigger guys does if it's a little bit cheaper. So that'll be impacted. It'll have a compounding effect, but not to scare anybody off. We'll kind of, I said I wouldn't get too much into it, but I just think it's a really interesting thing to study. So I encourage you to look a little bit more into it and see what's going on with that and how it may impact the greater market. So latest breach news that's going on, or at least recently that we've seen, and there hasn't been that much since we last talked back in February. The latest edition, the February edition of the DPP install is now available on Apple Podcasts. Apologize, but it's also on YouTube in case this ever happens again. And I'm going to try to pronounce this name as best I can, but there were really only 2 fines from the GDPR that I thought were worth including. Nothing very big, especially like we talked about last time. So a company based out of Finland, this is going to be tough, so you guys are going to have to forgive me on this. Suomen Asiakastieto Oy. feel free to reach out if you actually know how to pronounce that better and can give me some pointers. A 440,000 euro fine was levered against this company. They what ended up happening was it was unlawful storage of data subjects information. So a while back, the Data Protection Agency, DPA, that's kind of responsible as the supervisory authority with GDPR over organizations that are in the union. They ordered the organization to remove the data of data subjects, and the organization did not comply, resulting in a violation of Article 58 from the GDPR, which the article in summary gives the powers to the supervisory authority to impose penalties and fines and basically enforce the regulation on organizations. So ordered something to happen, didn't comply, rather large fine that it was incurred by that organization for not complying fully with the order from the DPA. Other one, company out of Spain, Grupo Norconsulting, much smaller impact, $15,000 fine. Data subjects submitted a complaint to the Data Protection Agency for the controller's failure to properly erase, delete, destroy information, and the company did not comply with that request, and so the DPA stepped in, issued a fine in violation of Articles 15 and 17, which is a right of data subjects have a right to access their information and also have a right to request deletion of any of that information. So like I said, two just small ones. There's wasn't a lot of decisions made, I guess, around the penalties and such over the last month or so, which is good in a way. No news is good news, I guess. When it comes to issuing some of these fines, we can assume it may mean companies are either doing a good job to protect themselves or there's just not much going on. Essentially, it's interesting to track some of this stuff. Shifting over to HIPAA breach information. So two of the bigger ones over the past month, wanted to look at one business associate and one healthcare provider. Not go too deep into it because of the other content we'll get to today. Cerebral Incorporated had this one was actually quite large. Hopefully the folks, whoever you are listening, is not affected by this. Almost 3.2 million individuals, which is approximately the population of Arkansas, were affected, which is just kind of insane that is how large it was. But it was an unauthorized access of a network server. Still investigating on what exactly happened, but that's essentially what they ended up seeing as the cause for that. So unfortunately, February 28th was when this was reported as the day of the breach. So let's hope that they can get that taken care of. Anyone affected is not, harmed in any sort of way. The other one is a healthcare provider, CentraState Healthcare Systems, had 617, almost 618,000 individuals affected. This number is approximately half the population of Hawaii, which is fairly significant, I would say. The hacking incident involving a network server occurred on February 10th. Same thing with Cerebral, still investigating kind of the root cause of the incident. But at the moment, that's kind of what's going on. Hopefully no one was affected by that's listening to this today. If you are, the organization should have reached out to you and with some measures to kind of reduce the effect, reduce the net, make the net a little bit smaller as it was cast out over a lot of those individuals and some of the harms on their information. So hopefully you weren't affected by that. A few other kind of reported breaches, rather interesting one that popped up on the radar last week. So there's a organization called DC Health Link, which runs an exchange where customers essentially can get, kind of healthcare, other services in that neighborhood of what they do. And they experienced a security event recently that, quote unquote, could be extraordinary, as cited by the Associated Press. And I'll add in some of the links to a lot of these stories for everybody in the show notes, so you can check those out later on. Maybe do a little bit deeper dive if you want. But this exposed sensitive data of a lot of lawmakers and their families. As you can imagine, lawmakers probably had all their family members included on their health plan. And so it's widely believed Russian cyber criminals were responsible for it. The information was actually found on a dark web exchange hosted by, it was a forum claimed by a hacker known as the Kilab, no space in there. Well, over tens of thousands of health records were stolen pertaining to a lot of federal lawmakers. So is fairly significant breach that happened. You kind of expect a company handling information for lawmakers to be a little bit more HIPAA compliant. Well, I say HIPAA compliant. Let me back that up. They were, in fact, HIPAA compliant. However, this is something that myself and a few other my colleagues have a difficult time trying to convey to executives that may not have the I guess all the information or the same insight on the data privacy and privacy technology front. Just being compliant at a baseline level at this rate, 2023 and beyond, is not going to be enough anymore in order to fulfill a lot of the promises and obligations that a company has towards its customers. If you think of a good example to use other than this one, if you have, let's say you want to be HIPAA security compliant, and we have access procedures in place, there's a good chance that there's still some kind of vulnerability included with those access procedures. A lot of time multi-factor is a good way around it, but hackers that we know and cyber criminals have figured out ways to get around stuff like that, and not necessarily need a massive background in how to run complex algorithms and other things like that in order to break into systems. A lot of times it's just systems that we don't give as much thought to, non-production systems, development, build environment, staging, and so on, that in some capacity may interact with the external web, or it can be other various ways, social engineering, of breaking into systems. So today we'll talk a little bit about kind of engineering and privacy, a lot of the roles and responsibilities of an engineer, some risk management as well. This is, and for those of you following along with the textbook, this one right here, this will be chapter 2, as we kind of go through the introduction to privacy series that we've been started off last month and are still going to be kicking through as we go. All right, so chapter 2, engineering and privacy. So the privacy engineers' roles and responsibilities, kind of talk through some of these and give a couple of examples if I can think of them off the top of my head as we go. But primarily when this person in the organization, they're going to sit between the legal professionals, lawyers, general counsel that serve the organization, and the technology professionals at the organization. And the reason for this is, we're going to start just with the laws and regulations part of it and branch out a little bit. The reason being is because there is, if anyone that's listening has had any experience with this, there's a pretty significant disconnect, especially with the rate that technology's advanced in the last 20 to 30 years. Pretty significant disconnect between what's possible, what's not possible, and what is utterly impossible as far as what technology can do for the organization, what we expect it to be able to do, how we can understand what we need from a legal perspective, what we need, and how we can kind of model that into the design of the privacy system. So lawyers and technology, the privacy engineer is primarily sits between a lot of that stuff. You know, your job is to communicate the legal requirements to the technology professionals that are building the systems, maintaining the systems, securing the systems, providing access to those systems, backup recovery, restore testing. You know, the folks that do a lot of that stuff, some of the IT general controls with my Sarbanes-Oxley-esque background, doing a lot of those ITGC stuff. And then we'll look at what the lawyers are doing. Their, you know, primary goal is to look at where's the company exposed legally and how do we need to do things to make sure that this doesn't happen to us if, you know, we're operating out of the state of Texas. How can we protect social security numbers, driver's license numbers? How can we comply with the Identity Theft Protection Act, the biometric data that we need to protect as well, the Fair Credit Reporting Act and other things like that, the Medical Records Protection Act in the state of Texas. How can we build technology solutions that will be able to meet the regulatory requirements of some of those acts? Because a lot of processes, as we, you know, just society and organizations move into becoming more efficient, more lean, doing process automation, taking advantage of synergies, economies of scale, trying to cut out some of the more manual intensive jobs to reposition resources into doing other more productive things for the organization rather than just doing data entry the whole time. Those solutions need to be built with privacy in mind and not necessarily what we've seen a lot of. And I posted on to LinkedIn the other day for those of y'all that follow. The state of data privacy in America has, you know, greatly accelerated over the last decade. What we see a lot of companies doing, since privacy wasn't really something top of mind and probably not very heavily regulated up until the last several years, especially once GDPR and TCPA came into the fold, we didn't see or at least track for the most part a ton of decisions around some of the privacy infractions. And so systems weren't designed in order to meet some of those privacy obligations. Obviously, some of the stuff that privacy lawyers and technology professionals communicated to each other meets a certain extent. Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, is a good example of how you need various IT controls in place to protect the data that ends up on your financial reports when you do your 10K, 8K, and all those other ones that companies have to report to shareholders now, to just kind of show the financial position and where the organization sits, its risks, how they're trying to mitigate some of those risks, and future outlook and stuff like that. So, and that kind of circling back to the original topic as well, the privacy engineer needs to be the one that, you know, meets with whether you have access to the information. Maybe you are able to get together with the council of your organization, whoever that may be, look at, okay, where's the biggest areas that we have exposure? Where are the biggest, you know, laws and regulations that probably apply to us from the privacy front? You know, folks in California have been doing this for a little while as well. They, you know, CPRA and Virginia as well also have the privacy laws are now in effect at this point. We have a few other, Colorado, Utah, and Connecticut coming into play here very soon. in January at the end of December this year. And we've seen a very large uptick in the amount of state privacy laws getting introduced. And I, don't want to knock on it. We saw something very similar last year and 2 years ago. Tons of stuff gets put in through the pipeline and then ends up not making it all the way through and not winning enough votes. Last year we saw Connecticut earn its right, as well as Utah. The year before that, Colorado was the lone state to do it. And then prior to that, Virginia and California before that. So, it's slow moving ball. It's like a snowball that's been rolling downhill at a very, very almost level incline to where it's barely moving at all, but it's still gathering up and eventually going to make it all the way down, but it may take some time. So knowing what those regulations are, how they apply to the organization related to what information we need to protect. A lot of times it'll be personal identifiable, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, first name, last name, home address, email. HIPAA actually categorizes, what is it, 18, I think. I advise you to go look that up yourself. Approximately 18 pieces of information. When a couple of them blended together, they actually constitute what would be considered electronic personal health information. So you obviously, name alone is not going to be it, but it would be something like name, address. I think we've talked about this on a previous show. Name, address, ethnicity, religious beliefs, some of that demographic information that can get collected to identify somebody's zip code and location and stuff like that. So how are we protecting that information at the organization? How can we build privacy controls? Whether it's a bolt-on approach, that's not the most effective because it has a tendency to kind of make systems a little less functional. Because maybe, for example, if we have to, surprise this doesn't happen already, let's say we haven't encrypted a backend database for a very heavily used application at the organization. The backend database doesn't get encrypted, which you'd have to authenticate to get into the application first. So there's that layer. But anyway, backend database isn't encrypted. So whenever we do encrypt it, it has to run the process of decrypting the data before providing it to the end user. That can really have a hit to the latency of the application. And sometimes when that happens, it can really cause a both decline in user experience as well as just business functionality. And obviously when we experience a higher amount of latency, we kind of get very frustrated. For instance, I don't remember when this was, several years ago. I'm sure there's more content out there on it. But some of the things we were studying during my undergrad years was the kind of amount of acceptable latency time. So if I were to put a website's address in and it takes longer than 5 seconds to spin up or go to the next page, I'm clicking off and I'm going to a new website, and that website's kind of lost me as a customer because it's that instant gratification. I want stuff now, I want it fast. We don't want to wait very long. Completely understand as well. Like I think everyone's the same way. It's not a ton of fun to be waiting on something because of your expectations are probably a little bit higher for that kind of stuff. But as we flow down through kind of those roles and responsibilities, talked a little bit about them, trying to bridge the gap between legal and technology professionals, and translating the regulations into privacy designs, privacy controls for new systems and existing systems. We also want to look at the capabilities of the technology that we're currently using, and it's possible that some of the solutions we have are not able to actually have privacy controls built onto them at all. And, quite frankly, if that's the case for an organization that has to be compliant with regulations related to consumer data protection laws, needs to figure out how to transition into some new tool, which is, quite daunting, especially nowadays as data collection has become just more and more prevalent in just how organizations operate. I mean, I don't know of an organization, an established organization. By established, essentially they've been in operations for 20 to 30 years at this point with a very defined customer base. I don't know how an organization that is at that point in 2023 not doing some hardcore data collection on website traffic and other of those more marketing channels to try to figure out how can we get new customers, and looking into, this is one of the things we briefly talked about earlier, the efficiency of companies really getting down to that CAC, which is your cost to acquire customer, and looking into, does our technology stack allow us to collect that information? But if we do, how are we protecting that information? Because if you're collecting that information, especially without a consumer's consent, you open yourself up to a very large world of legal liability. I mean, granted, there aren't very many that allow for a private right of action, which basically means personally, Hunter can take company X to court for what they did. GDPR allows this stuff. So as and I said last time we talked, there was an individual that took action against it. You'll see a lot of those. They're all sort of smaller fines, roughly from a couple $100 to maybe 2,000 or 3,000 euros. Sorry. But you just don't see that in America. A lot of it is by the Attorney General of the state that needs to take action. Obviously, I can submit requests to them saying, hey, company X did this, it's in violation of XYZ, and they can decide to take action or not. But I, as a citizen, especially of the state of Texas where I live, I don't have the ability myself to take action against an organization on my own. I would need to go through the proper channels, have the state attorney kind of look into it and see if it's actually a case that's worth bringing up related data protection. The capabilities of technology are very important when trying to make some of these strategic decisions and trying to figure out, is this something we as an organization are comfortable with accepting this risk, or is this something we need to mitigate further, maybe look into something new entirely, or what can we bolt on to kind of help us cover up that risk, reduce it a little bit. Collecting user feedback is another big piece. In my opinion, anyone that's building a product that someone like you and I, general customers, not organizations, but individuals, data subjects, however you want to categorize us or call us, anyone that's building a product that targets consumers needs to have a user-centric process around designing these systems. We don't want it, not designing it for how we are planning to use it, but designing it with the user in mind. So if I'm going to use a good example, if I'm going to use an application, if I'm going to go hiking and I want to use an application that shows me local routes where I'm at, and then recommends them based on maybe my comfort level, whether it's we rank beginner, intermediate, advanced, maybe even how I call it, years of experience hiking, if that's even a metric you can use. Years of experience walking might be another metric you can use for that. And I would say, over 20 years of walking experience would be my criteria for hiking. But anyway, giving you recommendations based on kind of location and then hiking preferences as well. If the application should be designed in a user-centric, like me and you are going to be using this application, what are the privacy harms that could go into something like this? Obviously knowing where our location is in order to recommend trails to us is going to be one of the kind of major privacy concerns. If the company knows that about us, how can the organization take measures to protect user privacy and user location while still delivering the service that the user needs and wants from that organization? So feedback, keeping the user central, knowing like, what is it the users are looking for, what violates their trust, and what are they okay providing, especially if you say your data is going to be used in this way. Most customers are very comfortable, a lot more comfortable providing it as long as they know how their data is being used. If they don't know how their data is being used, it's kind of that fear of the unknown will trump our kind of fear of the known in some way. More additional responsibilities too. We're kind of getting close to the end of it. Thankfully, we'll just talk a little bit more about risk management here soon, but more of the privacy engineers' roles and responsibilities as it pertains to kind of making sure the company not necessarily, I mean, yes, is compliant with privacy rules, but we're more so talking about building, helping technology professionals build those privacy controls into systems early on in the SDLC. You obviously want to monitor news, updates, and privacy issues around the world. We talked about several of them earlier with a couple finds, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about them now later on in the party poopers section towards the end as we conclude the show. Some good ones, actually, that I'm looking forward to talking through, but we'll get there when we do. Be monitoring that stuff and see where do you have exposure. Is that something that you even do anything with? Yeah, I can, for example, SBB closing down shop on Friday does not affect data privacy party in the least bit because we do not have a bank account with them. So we know, okay, we're not exposed at all. No one that we interact with on a regular basis has exposure there. We're completely covered by some of the, I'll say a lot of it is just coincidence, but we're covered by what we chose to do. I could have, back when it was started, could have decided to go with SVB and instead deciding not to is I guess for most part, a happy accident, and not needing to worry as much about trying to go and withdraw money. But anyway, the last kind of major role of the engineer, the privacy engineer, you need to be identifying those risks and harms to systems. So we've already talked about how you sit between the lawyers and the tech professionals. You translate those regulation requirements into technology, design controls. What are the capabilities of technology? Combining those two worlds and collecting user feedback. Well, now we need to figure out, in addition to all those things, we also need to look at what are some of those privacy harms that affect the users. So kind of what I'm talking about, user-centric design. It kind of helps us know what are we going to be doing that may be some harmful to the user in some capacity. Obviously, data collection in and of itself is not necessarily a harm. However, it's stuff that can be done with that information collection. So two things that can kind of happen from that. One is surveillance of an individual. So this is exactly kind of how it sounds, looking at what is it that this person's doing on a day-to-day basis, or, you're collecting trail information. What trails is this person going on? And maybe you share some some trails get a little bit advertised to them in some capacity. Maybe you get a notification that thanks for checking out this trail. Maybe check out this one later. Well, an individual may feel like their privacy is being kind of creeped in on. And so they know, oh, wow, this app knows I went on this trail on this day. So maybe they'll never go back to that trail, or they could stop using the app entirely because they feel like their privacy has kind of been infringed upon. So, for instance, it would lead an individual to a change of behavior that they otherwise would not have done if they didn't realize their information was being used in order to kind of surveil them in a way. The other information collection activity is called interrogation. So it's and most folks I think are familiar with what interrogation is. But basically trying to extract information from someone, whether it be by non-harmful or harmful means, whichever the case may be. It kind of goes under information collection. So maybe with the Trails application, they are collecting more information on you. Okay, you liked this trail. Well, give me your input. What was it like? Why did you like it? How would we recommend it to more people? What was your experience on it? And, masquerading the information collection with let us customize your experience. And, it may be, you may be comfortable doing that, because the service offering that they provide is just that much better. If you provide more information, which might very well be the case. I know it is for various services, but at the same time, you kind of are sacrificing privacy in order to gain a little bit of functionality, which can, in a way, constitute a bit of a dark pattern. We can talk about those later on down the road, but that's essentially falls under the definition of what a dark pattern is. You experience, you don't get full functionality without providing more information. But I mean, it's to customize the experience more for you. So there's certain aspects of it that they can't provide you unless you tell them a few other pieces of information. Other risks and harms, information, we'll go through these kind of 4 main ones. But information collection, sorry, I already said that one. Information processing. This can constitute 3 different areas, which is identification, or different examples rather. Identification, secondary use, as well as insecurity. So obviously identification, we can aggregate information in order to identify someone. My name alone, my name fairly unique, so you probably would be able to identify me, but John Smith, there's probably a ton of those out in the world, so it'd be very difficult to identify who exactly you're talking about if that was just first and last name. If we included maybe home country, home state, zip code, definitely home address, phone number, that sort of demographic information would eventually lead us to, okay, you're the exact person that we've identified and talked about. Other one, secondary use, is kind of it's the way it sounds. If we collect information for one purpose and then decide, hey, let's do this as well with that information, without that new processing of information being part of the initial purpose for collection. So in other words, the data subject who said, yes, we can collect their information to do X process has not consented to us doing process Y. So that would be a secondary use violation where we're repurposing information we collected for one thing and we're doing something with it that we have not received consent for another. The last example of information processing, I'll say, is insecurity. So this is essentially an individual kind of feeling like they basically don't have control of what's going on. It's kind of the result of a failure to protect information on the company's part. Can be sort of the individuals if they're negligent, but for the most part, an organization failing to protect that information of the individual, data breach, exposure, just information leakage, stuff like that, getting in the hands of hackers, which doesn't constitute an actual harm until that information is used in order to commit a harm against the individual, such as find the information, give them a call and try to extort them for X amount of money because they are going to steal their identity and do stuff with it. Stuff like that constitutes the insecurity bucket. Information dissemination. Some examples would be a breach of confidentiality. Information that was meant to be confidential gets exposed, and your private information becomes public. Distortion, which we can modify someone's information and kind of change the story, paint a new picture about who they are to the world, and probably a lot of fake information, something that they're not, and kind of turn maybe some folks against them. For instance, if someone stands for Proposition A, and they end up getting painted somehow as they stand for Proposition B, that may kind of affect their future, relationships and so on. Little dumbed down example of it, but kind of how that would work. Appropriation, you just steal someone's identity because that information's been leaked out. Kind of goes a little bit with insecurity we talked about, and also blackmail. You learn. Ashley Madison hack is a great example of this. You obtain the private information of some folks that were using that website, which is, a website that was designed for individuals to cheat on their spouse with others. A lot of people committed suicide. I say a lot, but quite a few people committed suicide when that information was leaked out, and they were told, give me $50,000, $100,000, or I'm going to tell your spouse you were using this website. And so rather than pay the ransom or take ownership of what they've done, instead, the decision was to take the route of suicide. So that, definitely constitutes a harm. Lastly, the invasion and intrusion of someone's privacy. This would kind of be decisional interference. So, for instance, if I wanted to go do something, do X, but I knew that there was some form of privacy harm that was going to befall me if I did it, then I would decide not to do it. Just kind of interfering with a decision I would make if I did not feel as though I was under duress in some capacity. So those are kind of the major four harms: information collection, information processing, info dissemination, and invasion and intrusion that a privacy engineer needs to be aware of as it pertains to the information that they've collected, especially on consumers. But also you can pivot it over and apply to a company's IP and other crown jewel data that they use, especially what is used to kind of make financial and strategic decisions. Definitely financial data for a public company falls under this route. I mean, if they don't keep up with their information properly, it can result in various material weaknesses, and then cause for a lot of restatements. Material weakness, for folks, that are unfamiliar, essentially it is a issue that has an impact on an economic decision of the company. So in a very small example, I'll put, if we misreport cash as $2,000 instead of $3,000, then we are going to, rather than, we actually have, let's say this, we actually have $3,000, but we report it only as having $2,000. We decide that we're not going to invest more money into a new piece of technology, new privacy controls, and then down the road, we end up getting hit with a privacy lawsuit because we didn't invest in that information, when if we had reported it correctly, we would have been able to invest in those proper controls and covered up and not been exposed. Granted, that example is very, very general and basic. I have never been, and don't plan to become a financial statement auditor. I have a little bit of knowledge, but that's really not the field that I operate in. So if you are listening to this and you are one and thinking that's not at all what a material weakness is, please forgive me. My example was incredibly basic and was designed for folks that don't do it on a regular basis to understand what is an MW and some of the steps for remediation. That involves going back through financials for years and trying to restate them and categorize. It's I've been a part of some of those restatements on the IT SOC side, and I can tell you it involves quite a bit of work, not just on the financial side, but on the IT side, especially when ITGCs fail and you have to think of new ones and have to have them operate effectively for a certain period of time. Quite the ordeal. But Those are the roles, privacy engineers' roles and responsibilities. I want to talk about risk management before we kind of get into our last bit. So as everyone who has ever conducted a risk assessment in any capacity, whether it's formal, external, internal, whatever you want to be, even your own personal life of maybe should I go out to eat or should I stay home and cook dinner, looking at the cost associated, everyone has done a form of risk management. So, we understand it as probability multiplied by impact equals the risk rating. So the probability that a risk scenario will occur, and if it does, the impact that that'll have on various components of the organization, financial, service level, reputation, stuff like that. Another way of looking at it is kind of the same metric. It'd be frequency multiplied by magnitude, frequency being the probability, but a little bit different. Frequency being, we know it's going to happen. It's not necessarily a will it or will it not. We know it's going to happen. Just how often does this happen? And then magnitude, very similar to impact, but more on a repetitive scale. Just continuing to, if it happens, once a year and it only costs us $10,000, we can probably accept that risk if we're a large enough organization, versus much smaller organizations probably want to take some steps in order to make sure that that $10,000 impact gets lowered to 5, maybe 1 to 0 if you can really figure out how to do it. But it, and that goes back to when I say material weakness, the threshold of materiality for an organization is very, very different depending on kind of how much basically how much money they bring in on an annual basis. But there's other factors that go into it than just that. So some of the risks that we want to be aware of at the organization are related to individuals and data, kind of based on some of those harms I mentioned earlier, the frequency at which the risk activity is occurring, as well as the magnitude of the risk realized. Here's a great example. So an organization, we go back to we talked about that back-end database example not being encrypted. So the lack of encryption is not actually a risk. Now, I know some folks may think, yes, it is because encryption, but, let's take a step back. Those of us listening, you and I being within the technology space, are going to look at that a little bit different than someone that's maybe in the operations side or the accounting side or the side that's much less technical, because we see lack of encryption. Okay, data is just in clear text. Anyone can see it and read it. Versus someone on another side of it may think, well, yeah, I need to be able to see that data to do my job. I don't really care if it's encrypted or not. I need to see it in order to do my job. The risk would be someone obtaining the encrypted data, using it to identify an individual, and then surveil them and possibly inflict emotional or physical harm. Identity theft being a form of that, and actually, profiting off of committing fraud in some capacity. Various components of fraud. The fraud triangle, forgive me, I don't remember what it is, but there's 3 different things to commit fraud. One of those things being that obviously the opportunity, but also just is there a benefit to actually acting on it. So the risk of scenarios, not necessarily, hey, the database isn't encrypted. It's what happens when a threat actor gets access and takes that information. What is it that could happen that could actually result in a tangible or even intangible harm, kind of depending on, I know the intangible harm would be someone changing their daily, let's say we go to a coffee shop every day to go get coffee, but now that we know that person X has our information and they told us they're going to start showing up at that coffee shop every day now demanding money, we're probably going to change our route and not go to that coffee shop anymore. Just kind of a general example. Another area to kind of practice risk management for the privacy engineers, you need to look into doing what is called a traceability matrix. And probably something that's already kind of in play at the organization to some extent. I know that there's about 1 million frameworks out there from different organizations, some a little bit better than others. I know that NIST is a very popular one that a lot of folks like to leverage, as well as ISO, and then a few others that really do a phenomenal job of helping companies understand how can we manage risk best and how can we secure what we have to the best of our ability. But basically, the traceability matrix would track, what is the compliance requirement, where, what's affected at our organization by that, and then what controls do we have in place, to mitigate against, the possibility that could happen. So an example, let's look at HIPAA security. HIPAA security requiring policies and procedures. So the organization has a data privacy policy in place. And in that privacy policy, we say that we encrypt EPHI. Let's go down a level deeper. Data at rest is encrypted using something like SHA-256. And, that's just an example of the traceability matrix at play. It's a little bit more complicated, but HIPAA is a great one, especially since there's an appendix in section 164 that can kind of help you trace some of those safeguard requirements and where are your controls, and how can they meet the HIPAA security needs of the organization. So I mentioned frameworks earlier too. I want to call out a couple of them that are great to use, especially for privacy professionals. So obviously the NIST privacy risk model is a great one, as well as ISO 31000 being in the privacy risk management space. The FIPS, Fair Information Privacy Principles are also a great thing to use. And then also the generally accepted privacy principles from the AICPA. That's one personally I like quite a bit, because that one kind of hammers on a lot of different areas. You can map NIST over to it, the NIST privacy framework, as well as COBIT risks and the SOC 2 criteria as well, for the privacy component. The trust services criteria all kind of get mapped into one. GDPR articles as well go into it. So that, each one of them serves a great purpose. We can even throw some data governance ones out there, like Data Governance Institute, as well as Oracle, IBM also have their own frameworks, kind of specific to different areas. In my opinion, the Data Governance Institute is the one that's I don't want to say easiest. That's not the right word choice, but provides the more general baseline to what organizations could do. I've used it in the past for some clients, and we definitely call out some good areas that they're doing something very well, and then there's others that they just don't do at all, that, hey, you need to start putting this in place if in fact you want a data governance model that we're not necessarily looking at compliance, but we're looking at how we can do the three main things, which is protect people, processes, and technology, and how those kind of integrate together. Now, the DGI framework is not necessarily people, processes, technology, but if you look at their three main components, the technology part being the rules and rules of engagement, their documentation of policies and procedures being the policies part, and then kind of shareholder involvement being the people part of it. So this still makes up the three main components, but definitely something that I personally like to use whenever organizations are first getting their data governance policies and procedures and just environment stood up. So in privacy requirements for engineering, there's really two types that we need to look at, and I'll just briefly go through these, but pretty easy to understand. We have functional, we have non-functional. So the functional would be indicating a specific function of the system. We want to make sure function X works with our privacy controls in place, and then non-functional would be more of a constraint or property of the system. So it's not necessarily something that has to be a specific part of the system, but it's something that is kind of I don't know how best to put it. Just, it's not a process X doesn't do this. It's more the non-functional requirement, kind of a access in a way. but you can kind of tie that into role-based access. If someone doesn't have this role, they can't access this kind of stuff. The other area, we just need to make sure we have a completeness argument to use to verify all gaps are covered in the SDLC when we're trying to implement some privacy controls. Just looking at the risks, threats to what we're doing to consumers, the end users, and how can we put stuff in place to mitigate against a lot of this. And lastly, high-level design is the last thing I'm going to cover today, and it's actually going to be quite brief. Basically, it just describes how the system is supposed to implement those functions and non-functional requirements. This is something that gets put together kind of at the beginning of the development process, and then it kind of triages into some of the more low-level design type of stuff. How are users going to access it? What's the access method? Where's data going to be stored? How are we going to back the system up? Kind of regular stuff like that goes more into kind of those IT general controls and how are privacy controls going to impact some of those already, the functional requirements that we want out of the system in order to meet end user needs. So that kind of covers all the engineering and privacy, roles, responsibilities, risk management, chapter 2, mainly of the introduction to privacy. I hope you guys learned something good. I'll be sure to put a lot of these notes in the show notes so you guys can check them out. But thanks for being a part of that. So go right into the last bit of the show. I want to use it to talk a good bit about our party poopers. This is where we cover our individuals, organizations, and then some regulations and laws that are kind of, whether they're coming through the pipeline or it's stuff that we want to talk about. I'll start off with the regulations and laws because those are kind of the more, there's not as much about that one right now that I want to look at. But basically, Kentucky and Montana provide privacy proposals are moving forward. So Kentucky's Senate Bill 15 was moved into a second reading for the Senate Rules Committee. This is kind of a big deal. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of states are starting to enact more or introduce more privacy laws. This one would give consumers the right to access or delete their personal data, to opt out of targeted advertising, tracking, and sale, and then some additional measures as well that we see in the same bills, Colorado, Connecticut, and so on. Montana, for instance, Senate Bill 384, they unanimously passed the act that establishes consumer data privacy. So we'll see what happens with these two. They made it through committee, so now we get to go see if it gets voted on and approved. And then we'll see if they do, we'll look forward to seeing them in 2024. All right, so the individual party pooper I want to bring up, this is a story that surfaced last week. So LastPass, great, organization, in my opinion. I use them or have used them in the past for password management. A DevOps engineer had their home computer hacked, if you will, not too long ago. So they had a third-party media player on their computer, and a hacker was able to take advantage of a vulnerability in that third-party media player in order to get access into LastPass customer passwords. So I'll drop the link to that story. Darkreading.com is phenomenal coverage of the story. So I highly recommend going there, checking out the show notes, and taking a look as well on there. But that'll give you more information on what exactly ended up happening and why. But just kind of funny. It kind of shows with, a lot of people thought there would be a lot of risks with remote work from home stuff, and there's plenty, especially if you're using a BYOD policy and someone's using that at home and they have organization sanctioned applications on their computer, and then attackers can use that in order to get access to some organization business applications. So the last of the 3 that we talk about in the party pooper section, I'm looking forward to chatting through. So we already talked about DC Health Link. That was the one that serves members of Congress. So a lot of information on federal lawmakers and their families was exposed by Russian cyber criminals, to our knowledge. and based on what's been reported. So we already talked a little bit about that. I'm not going to talk more about it at this point. The other major one I had, SVB, Silicon Valley Bank shutters. I'll include a link to the story on that one. We already talked about that one though, so I'll skip over it. The good people at my home state, in state of Texas, had a event recently. February 27th was when it was reported on. So just kind of shows anybody's vulnerable and susceptible. The Department of Public Safety ended up shipping approximately 3,000 individuals, so thousands of Texas driver's license to an international organized crime group in a security lapse that is still under investigation. Department of Public Safety said that the primary affected individual were those of Asian descent, targeted by what was described as a Chinese organized crime group based in New York, working in a number of different states, which you can't be surprised as far as what many states they're working in. So they're currently investigating what ended up happening. So there were about 2,400 driver's license shipped to what were called third-party addresses, not, obviously the home address of any of those people. And, DPS had to report it, of course. And, a separate portal, the Texas Department of Information Resources, was where someone goes to request a driver's license, and they found approximately 4,000 fraudulent accounts were created. 2,400 of those licenses were all shipped to third-party addresses created by those fake accounts. So they learned about it towards the end of last year, but they actually hadn't notified the affected Texans because they've been working on the criminal investigation, apprehending those responsible. And supposedly, some have been arrested already. This is kind of one of those, we don't hear about it until much later after it happens, just because they don't want to alert the criminals that they're coming after them. So, party pooper to the Texas Department of Public Safety, unfortunately, but it just shows the best of us can all get duped as well. Lastly, before we kind of wrap up the show, so this one is quite a very interesting story, especially because of kind of the maybe not historical, but future looking implications of what may happen based on the outcome. Back in October of 2022, an organization, BNSF Railway, lost a Biometric Information Privacy Act case out of Illinois, BIPA. And so it's a very, very interesting story. So they'd been using a fingerprint scanner to clock employees in and out. A lot of companies with a large number of employees have kind of moved towards that sort of style, that have some hourly folks, because it just makes it a whole lot easier to keep track rather than having folks enter in their username and password. I worked some hourly jobs back in my high school days where you'd put in your username, password to clock in and clock out as well, kind of an archaic non-user interface type of system. But they worked well. But if you look at kind of, sometimes people, and most of the time, myself kind of included, we don't want to remember the username and password that we use maybe once or twice a day on something that's fairly, obviously clocking in and clocking out is a pretty consequential process because it's how you get paid. But rather than having to make employees remember that, all they need to do is come in, scan their fingerprint, clocked in, scan out, clocked out. Simple deal. What could go wrong, right? Well, what was found out was that BNSF did not give their employees all the information, not very transparent. This was decided by the judge. This isn't my own opinion about it. This was decided by the Illinois legal system. So the information on those fingerprints. Obviously, they were connected to the employee. How else would they know what employee is clocking in and clocking out if they didn't connect their fingerprints to that specific individual? And so in doing that, they collected data on all of their employees clocking in and clocking out, biometric information. And the Biometric Info Privacy Act's been in place for a while. But so the significance of this is the first class action lawsuit that an organization did not win. This is the first successful class action lawsuit brought against a large organization. And so they ruled on a $228 million judgment fee. This was calculated based on the number of, let me make sure I'm reading it off right, but essentially it was based off the number of infractions times the total number of employees. Yeah. 5,000 employees, 45,600 instances of noncompliance. Or sorry, not 5,000. $5,000 per instance of noncompliance for 45,600 instances that occurred. And so that resulted in a $228 million judgment. Now that number, sorry, the 45,600 was by employee. I don't want to get y'all confused. Sorry if you are. $5,000 per incident. And the court decided that there were 45,600 incidents that occurred for the number of employees. Now, another case was recently decided, Cawthron versus White Castle in Illinois, using a similar method, biometric data to clock in and clock out. They decided it was per scan, not per employee, like in BNSF. So they were awarded based on per scan, not per employee. Because of that, in post-trial motions, plaintiff has now filed to seek more damages. So this would end up tripling the amount awarded, which if that's the case, this ends up becoming 10% of BNSF Railway's Q4 revenue from 2022. Which is approximately $646 million. So at an organization like that, it can probably take the hit, I would imagine. However, if this sets a precedent, which it sounds like we very well may get that way, especially because BNSF was found to be negligent and blatantly disregarding the law for this very well could become the case. So I say this, why does this matter? What's the point? Anyone operating out of Illinois collecting biometric data on Illinois residents needs to be aware that they're going to eventually have this be per instance, not per employee. But I hope doesn't come as a big surprise to a lot of people. But the penalties awarded for companies that are breaking the law, a lot of times they don't realize it, but sometimes there's like known infractions that are going on. The penalties awarded for companies breaking the law are going to double, potentially triple, quadruple, because they're going to move and set the precedent that it's for instance, not per employee. So that's something I hope that people are very aware of. We'll kind of see how this plays out. I don't expect it to not be additional penalties on BNSF just because of the ruling in previous case. The only issue that they may run into, the defendants arguing there's been a lack of harm to the plaintiff, which is, very well probably the case. Just because the data, like we said earlier, just because something's not encrypted or collected doesn't actually constitute the fact that it's a harm to an individual. The individual would have to prove tangible consequences as a result of that information being collected, which I think is actually quite hard to do. A lot of times we can say, yeah, it changed up the way I make decisions about, what I do on a daily basis. However, a lot of those are intangible consequences. I think it's rather difficult to prove tangible consequences just because someone collected information on you. If that was the case, there's quite a few organizations out there that would be in a lot of trouble because they're just collecting information. But it's what happens with that information and what sort of harm gets experienced by the individual that would end up constituting the award. The only issue in this for future cases that, why I expect it to be tripled is, and I'll quote it too, just to make sure. So one of the partners from a firm that's kind of, helping out with the judgment, it was clear from the statute that in previous case law that damages were discretionary and the judge wouldn't have needed the White Castle decision to see that given the permissive language of the statute. So it could be that he'll say, hey, the plaintiffs are pushing me higher. BNSF says it should be lower. I'll just exercise my decision and keep it that way. So, and additionally, an attorney said here, the jury's finding of reckless and intentional violations puts this into a different category and puts the company in a more uncomfortable position. So although no harm was done, no sort of protection or responsibility, I guess you could put it, on BNSF's part would contribute to them kind of minimizing the damages of it. So, but we'll see what happens. It'll set a precedent going forward in the case of the previous White Castle. That makes it per instance is going to play a big role in the final decision of this. So that wraps us up. Thanks y'all for the conversation and discussions today on a lot of this stuff. I think some valuable information, especially stuff that's happened recently. I apologize again for not having a episode to y'all last month, but I think I've got a lot of that figured out, and we should look forward to more months going forward. So I look forward to talking more about this later on. Please share, like, subscribe, whatever else, if you found the information to be valuable today on whatever podcast platform, as well as YouTube, if you're going to find us there. And you can also find us at dataprivacyparty.com, checking out some of the content pieces we have and other podcast episodes. And, feel free to reach out too if you have any other questions. I'd love to just chat more privacy related stuff with y'all. But until next month, appreciate y'all. Take care and make sure you, protect your privacy like we've been talking about.